We're going to get started at 5. Sorry, Anna. All right. So we have a few written briefings. Council members, were there any questions in regards to those?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
there on the second written briefing about our calendar next year, one of the RDA meetings falls on my birthday, so I'm sort of expecting some presents. I just am letting you know now. It's in September, so you have time to think about it. Just have a little FYI.
I do see the RDA people here, you know.
Yeah.
Director Walls is over there smiling, so not really paying attention, but okay. And for those that are following along, also in our written briefing is the Council's District 5 vacancy process. So for those interested in filling the vacancy seat of District 5 of Mayor-elect Mendenhall's area, so you can follow that and look at the process. We're anxious and look forward to interviewing those candidates, and we'll talk more about that come January, but if there's no other questions, let's look into the first item on our agenda, which is the resolution for a public benefits analysis on the Magnolia project at 165 South, 300 East, and this is a follow-up. So I know that we have Allison Roland, who is our council office policy analyst, Dan Ripp, JP Goetz, Jennifer Mcgrath, interim Ken, deputy director, as well as here.
And Bailey.
And Bailey's here as well to talk about project, right?
Yes.
Nice.
And if I could just give a quick introduction, because we, based on council members' questions last time, this team came up with some responses that I think will be of interest to council members. One of those is that there was a question regarding the community land trust and why this parcel wouldn't have been considered for that. Essentially, the community land trust is made for properties that are structured differently and for different uses, because this is considered to be a rental property. It doesn't make sense to put it in the community land trust as it's currently formulated. A second one is regarding the 0% Housing Trust Fund interest rate that was recommended by the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board. The question was how much interest was foregone or is foregone if that amount drops from 2% to the 0% that was recommended. These folks did the calculations, and the amount of interest foregone by the city would be just over $500,000, which is about $215,000 in net present value. So that's the amount that's the difference between 0% and 2% over the length of the loan. A third item was a request to compare the structure of this deal with the previous deal, and they did that in quite a bit of detail. I won't, I think if there are questions about it, then I would defer to these folks because they can talk about it better than I can. But essentially, one of the big differences is that under the terms of this present deal, the city would retain ownership of the Magnolia portion of the original property rather than selling it to the developer. And also, the city would not provide a seller's note to the developer. So that does turn out to be better in this case for the city. A fourth question is whether the road home would be able to increase its annual fundraising to the amount required in the current proposal. The answer is yes, according to the road home, because they will be collecting tenant rent through Section 8 vouchers that are based on this project. So that seems to be an issue that is resolved. There were also questions to the attorney's office about whether the service provider, if in the future the service provider is not able to raise enough funds for the supportive services, and if the borrower defaults on senior loans, what would happen to the city's investment? Essentially, it varies a little bit depending on timing because the city is fourth among the loan in line for repayment. So depending on how much of that loan may have been repaid, it could vary. But at the end of the day, the 1.5 million, I just got that wrong. Yeah, no, I think that is right. 1.5 million proposed housing trust fund loan may be in jeopardy if the borrower defaults on loans. if the service provider isn't able to provide the supportive services required, there could be some issues related to that, but it would be in the interest of both the other loan holders and the city for the same use to continue, whether or not the road home or any other service provider is able to provide that service. And the key there is that the ground lease and restricted use for permanent supportive housing are senior in priority to the rights of the senior lenders. So that won't change, no matter what happens financially in the future, that restriction on the land. And then finally, right, because the land does remain city property no matter what, and that's a difference from the 255 State Street project. That was the question. Sorry, I've got myself tangled up. And that the city would, right, that the city's requirement to operate permanent supportive housing on the Magnolia site would survive developer defaults in the case that should happen, and the land would remain city property. So that's how it's structured differently from the 255 State Street project. I'll just mention one more thing. There was a public hearing on this item scheduled on the public benefits side of this item, scheduled for today, later today, and then the council could take action either today or at the December 10th meeting. So that's all I have. I don't know if some of the administration folks would like to add anything or correct anything.
No, you summarized it very well. Thank you.
Nothing to add? You're okay?
We're okay.
All right. Any questions, council members? Councilmember Johnston.
Thank you for that. I think in number 4, which is my question, the term fundraising generally led me to believe it'd be private money being brought to the table, but it sounds like the plan here is to use basically rent being paid to pay for that. Is that accurate?
Rent being paid would provide some support or some funding for the supportive services, but the road home would have to fundraise either through applying for grants from the state or the county or the city, or by doing their private fundraising that they do. But they don't anticipate that being too burdensome for them. They have a pretty robust development team and feel confident about getting that number annually.
Okay, thanks.
No? So we've got this on the, like Allison said, potentially, we've got a public hearing tonight, and we could take action on it tonight as well. So thank you for coming. And I think you still are here on the same item. You're here for this table. We're going to go on to item number 5, which is the resolution for the Housing Trust Fund loan, the Magnolia project at 165 South 300 East follow-up.
And essentially, I apologize for not making this clear, the updates were to
The same.
incorporate both.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that we were combining them. I thought that we were keeping
I
them separate.
apologize,
Nope,
Mr.
you're
Chair.
good. Any other questions before we move on to item 6? Great. We good?
Would it be appropriate for us to ask for a straw poll of the outcome for the public benefits analysis as well as the resolution for the Housing Trust Fund loan?
Just to see if the council supports that?
Correct.
I mean, I don't see if there's an issue doing that. We can do a straw poll. I mean, are all those in favor of the resolution for the Magnolia project, public benefit analysis, as well as the Housing Trust Fund loan for the Magnolia project at 165 South 300 East follow-up? If you're in favor of this project, give me a thumbs up. Okay, does that help?
Does, very much. Thank you.
Yep.
And if
Oh, I'm sorry. For the recorder, that was all of us were unanimous.
And if I could just add, since there will be a public hearing tonight, that may change some of these ideas. I think there's some of the preferences of the council members, but at any rate, there's a straw poll.
As of now, looks good.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is informational. We're going to be doing a bunch of funding our future quarterly updates, and the first one is on the housing. So we have Allison Rowland, who's still here, and we have a representative from CAN that's to be determined. I think we've got the determination here. We've got Lonnie Egertson-Goff, who's the director of HAND.
I have to apologize in advance. I have to use my spectacles, so I'm not trying to be disrespectful in looking down, but I probably will have to,
Great, and pull your microphone close.
gladly.
There you go. I might ask you for your spectacles too, so.
It may work.
I'm
for
sure they
you.
would. I can't see.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chair, let me just switch my literal and figurative files around. So there are two issues here. This item has to do, this is an update of the Funding Our Future Housing Trust, excuse
Housing
me,
program.
housing programs. This is why I need to look at my papers. So this will include both the year-end FY19 spending as well as the first quarter FY20 spending. And what something that we realized as we looked at these is about approximately $878,000 of FY19 revenue wasn't spent before the end of FY19. Now, we've got late-breaking information that actually it may be slightly less than that, approximately $28,000 less than that was not spent of the $878,000. Was not spent, so actually was spent, sorry. But the bottom line is that, so it will be, off the top of my head, $850,000, right? The other, I believe, let me see. So that will change some of the numbers in the staff report, but again, it's a relatively minor number. I do also want to mention, and as a reminder, that fiscal year 19 was actually the first time that both the council side and the administration side were dealing with this sort of arrangement with Funding Our Future funding that goes to particular programs, and that has to be essentially reviewed by the council, reviewed by hand staff, and then also, CAN staff, CAN, as well as the finance department. So there's actually a lot of moving pieces in these things, and in terms of sort of timing, so both in terms of reporting and in terms of the actual programs that were able to be funded in FY19, it was a learning year, I think, for everybody. And so I want to make that clear that some of this confusion is mine, others is because it's complicated. So there are, let me see. Actually, I'll let Hand speak if they'd like. I can make this fit, this spreadsheet fit. This is just for your reference. I can show you where the number is that we're concerned about. It's this 28,000, which apparently was not unspent. It was spent. There's a second question involving how this was encumbered. So it looks like there were two errors, and we're working on figuring those out.
So if I might, it feels like we are trying to look at both the update for the first year, year one, and potentially look at those funds that were not expended to be part of the conversation for this current year's FY 19-20. Am I speaking out of turn there?
No, I think that's fine. I think the way it's structured in the agenda is for the first discussion to be about this update and the second one to be about potential reallocation, if that makes sense.
And as basically serving as chair today, I don't have a problem discussing funding and looking at putting that funding somewhere, but we're not going to make a decision tonight when we've got two council members that would love to see how this money is to be spent as well.
Understood, yes. So I guess my hope would be that we focus most of our conversation on the current FY 19-20, and
Let me interrupt you and say
Certainly.
that the council really needs to decide that.
oh, okay.
I don't think you'll be displeased with it. It's just that we're getting things confused. So two issues, you know what they are, and let's let Allison keep.
I was actually the one who invited Hand to speak, so sorry if I led you astray.
I'm sorry, I just was worried about someone from the administration telling the council.
Understood.
So we're just getting an update now to talk about what the housing, what the fundings haven't been, the funds that have not been spent. We understand there's $28,000 that have been spent, so we're at $850.
Ish, yes.
And great, let's go from there.
Okay, so perhaps we should just move on to the FY '20
funding.
programs?
Unless council would like to hear any more about the previous year
I think it's great
one.
we have $850,000. Let's talk about those programs and why they haven't been spent and what we're
Okay,
looking at.
so I would be happy to speak to the 320,000 that was not expended, was potentially toward streamlining of permitting. And that was something that was brought to the council quite some time ago. I believe it was fall of last year. And that at that time, we received direction to not implement that type of a fee waiver or fee streamlining process related to affordable housing. So we did not pursue any programs or policies or process toward that within hand. So that money's just stayed there. We didn't use those. I think at the time the conversation was around impact fees. There was quite a bit of conversation around impact fees, and at the time there was an appetite, from my understanding, to move forward with that $320,000 to be spent towards fee changes. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Schuman. So that money was not expended. The other amounts have not, the $407,000 that's showing up on the screen, sorry, I am going to get dizzy if I look at the screen and try and read down here at the same time.
Councilmember Fowler, and we'll just start throwing out
Sorry
questions.
to
too.
interrupt.
Please do.
I want to go back and I would ask our staff, can I get an update, obviously not right now, an email would be fine, regarding that $320,000. And I think it was as part of our impact fee discussion, but I want to, we've dealt with a lot in a lot this year. And so if I can just get maybe a summary reminder of that, and also sort of maybe if Hand can provide what the details of that program were, because I imagine that may have been part of the discussion, but I'm not sure. So again, not today. We have a lot to cover and a lot of other things, but maybe if we can just get an email summary regarding that discussion and that particular program.
Absolutely, I can work with Hand and we'll get this information to everyone.
So the other dollar amounts are for census coordinator, and that is through the mayor's office, not through Hand. Also for planner position, that's the top line item, planner. And that is also not within Hand's purview for that funding, sorry. And then also the $175,000 at the bottom of the list, reallocation of those federal funds they were to be for a grant administrator, and those that position was funded through vacancy savings rather than using that amount. So that accounts for $600,000, and then the community land trust for $250,000. I don't see the line item number on that. I apologize. Those dollars were anticipated to be spent on properties, but during the time that during the past 9 to 10 months, we learned that, or we were told that the $250,000 couldn't be used on property that was already owned by Salt Lake City. And that, again, is a finance conversation that we're still trying to tease out. So those are all of the dollar amounts that were not yet expended.
And staff has asked for some clarification on this issue of the $250,000 because there are some differences of opinion. So we're working with attorney's office.
Yeah, so it's a combination really of the city attorney's office and finance they have to figure this out together with Hand.
Councilmember Fowler.
Sorry, one other question. The 175,000 for the reallocation of the federal funds, that money doesn't have federal strings attached to it, or does it? I mean, because usually when I see federal funds, it means we're getting it from the feds, and they tend to have lots of strings attached to them.
So typically, our grant administrators are funded by HUD dollars, right, federal dollars. So maybe the words are a little confusing here. The intention was to have a similar position, a grant administrator, for funding our future programs. And so we probably could have chosen some better words to describe that.
Okay, I just didn't want to, as we're talking about this reallocation of money, didn't want to get ourselves into a position where we think we're spending all this money and we have 175,000 and then it's like, oops, just kidding, we have to spend that on something that the feds tell us to spend it on, right? So just clarifying that. Thank you.
Thank you. So that covers, I think, all of the items under year one, or FY 18-19.
And then for FY20, I think I alluded to this earlier, these are the first quarter actuals on this spreadsheet. It reflects a relatively small number for this first quarter because, as you'll recall, the council requested that handwork to essentially revamp the entire process of getting the housing program money out to the community. And so I know you've been updated and involved in that process from the outset. So it's a little bit of a slow start, but HAND has been working to get everything caught up so that the FY21 process will be easy in comparison, right?
At least timing will be aligned a little better. So that's our hope. So would it be all right then if I step forward from where we were during our last briefing, and we identified that we had one project, one-page item that was not included in your packets initially, but it is in an updated transmittal that was provided. We would be happy to answer any particular questions about each of the funding requests that were, there were applications on each of those that we presented very quickly during our last briefing.
And there's 14, right? Just to make sure that we're all looking at the same sheet that we got.
So I think that Allison is pulling up the funding log.
Yes, and I'm not very happy with the way it fits or doesn't fit. Sorry about that. It's a little bit hard to see.
It's in our folder, though, too. So.
It is in your folder.
Yes.
It's in the packets. Making sure I have the right stuff in front of me again, sorry. Yes, so this is the current state of the program applications. As you can see, if we just look across these columns, the first column is the name of the applicant. Second is the amount of previous grants in FY19, should they have received them. The third is the application request amount from the applicant. The fourth is the mayor's recommendation. So HAND staff and the mayor went through these to come up with this mayor's recommendation. This column F is the one that I think the council is interested in working on and resolving today. G is, as we mentioned, the allocations with FY19 unspent funds, which the council can decide whether they'd like to discuss these or not today. Column H is the mayor's recommended budget FY20 program category. As you'll recall, there were program categories listed for many of these items, and that's the basis on which the council allocated amounts of money. So you can see some of these programs are surrounded by, or some of these applications are surrounded by boxes that just include themselves. Others, like this one, include 3 applications for rental assistance for vulnerable populations. And my phone is under here buzzing. Oh, wow. Sorry about that.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, Allison. Where is this information located right now?
It's in our folder.
I didn't see it in mine.
It's funding log, FOF, funding our futures, fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 2019.
So just two other comments I want to make on this before leaving it in your hands. One is that Councilmember Johnston may recall he works for Volunteers of America, and so he may want to recuse himself on discussions of that item. The second is that Councilmember Mendenhall suggested in our last discussion that she made a proposal to move the $76,000 that the mayor recommended for Community Development Corporation of Utah for their program, to shift all of that into the Salt Lake Community Action application, citing the fact that they seem to get, how many, 400 calls a month asking for rental assistance through their program. So those are the two items that are marked in yellow here, just as a reminder. Other than that, unless there are other questions, I think the council can.
I guess I'd like to get Hans' take on the programs and funding from inception, where you think, do you see any place that we might look to pivot programs, or where we're looking? I mean, if we're looking at doing that, I mean, some sort of pivot at point where you can say, yeah, you know what, our return of money is not being as effective here as it could be somewhere else.
We haven't really seen that yet, based on the ask or many asks from the community members. And honestly, with the Community Land Trust, for instance, we are still working on making sure that we provide the funds in an appropriate way for home ownership there. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Schuman, but I don't feel like we are at a pivot point quite yet. We want to make sure that we get these programs that are active and want to be moving forward doing so.
Okay. Council members, any questions? Yes, Councilmember Valdemoros.
So just looking at some of these numbers, the mayor's recommendation, which she worked with you, I mean, there's some huge discrepancies on what you allocate some of these organizations, and then what they requested, and then what you recommended to the mayor. And she has, can you explain that a little bit? For example, I'll give you an example here. The WYCA of Utah, they asked for $275,000 in emergency rent assistance, and there was zero allocated, versus First Step House, they asked for $432,000, and you recommend $385,000 of it. Like, I mean, they offer different service. You know, they serve different communities, but why is it this huge 0 to 90% of it to one organization?
I'll start and then maybe have my deputy step in on this question. This log that you have in front of you is a simplified version. The log that we provided at the last briefing is much more detailed. It has each of the applicants' requests and the number of households or individuals served, and a lot more detail about our criteria for the applications to be scored.
Looks like this up on the screen.
That's the really detailed one. So in the case of particularly YWCA, at the time that we discussed with the mayor, the number of folks that would be served at the YWCA was significantly lower than First Step House. And so just trying to weigh the $3-point-something million in ask with the 1.7 that's available.
Following up on that, the YWCA, and I think for me it's important to note for you that I'm sort of asking these questions because of that $870,000, right? That I don't think any decisions are going to be made, but I have questions that could influence those decisions. The YWCA, although it would only be reaching 3 households, those are 3 households with children, right? And I recognize that the First Step House does an amazing job, and I want to make sure that they have their funding, but their population that they reach is different, very different than the YWCA, right? So these are single men that are going through substance abuse issues, right? So those are the 2 different populations that these funds would be reaching. When you are doing the evaluation of the sort of scoring of the evaluation, is that taken into consideration? Like, I know probably number is taken into consideration, but like the varied populations that would be served? Is that taken into?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And I think at the time that we were receiving these, and please keep in mind, this is an accelerated process, and the realities of homelessness are very real today, right? And so we're looking, YWCA has 2 applications in. One is for mothers with children, and the second is going to be targeted towards women without children. As we think about the state of homelessness and moving folks into a housed space, certainly there's a greater need for men to be moved, not gender specific, but because of the number of men and the space that we have available for men in the community. And so the mayor had a lot of conversation about that as well. So there's kind of that balancing act in terms of who's being served and what other services are available in the community to meet those needs.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Johnston.
Could you maybe explain a little bit more about that process? So it sounds like you're saying that this is a gap-filling kind of funding you're looking at. So you're looking at the community, state, county, private nonprofits, et cetera, and evaluating what's being served now, and then seeing gaps and trying to target these funds to the gaps exclusively. Is that accurate, or is there some other nuance there to help council understand?
I think we do our best to identify those gaps. Do we hit them all? No. Do we understand all of them in the depth and breadth of them? Probably, I can honestly say no. But we certainly do our best. I feel like there's been a lot of conversation about men specifically and spaces for them to go, and being able to free up beds or spaces at First Step House allows more to flow into First Step House. And so that, I think that was the conversation and consideration around that one specifically. And then also recognizing that that the push currently is for men, individual men, not families, not women, to get them rapidly housed because of the limited amount of space that we have.
Mr. Chair, may I ask another question? Is there a simple, concise way to explain that in the context of this sort of going forward, or is that impossible, you think?
Are you talking about like homeless resource capacity and all those?
No, I'm thinking about laying out, I know that the previous one up on the table right now gives us more information, but doesn't necessarily explain the prioritization process from the committee, the scoring and all those factors that come into play. There may not be a concise way to do that. That might just be individual meetings and those kind of things, but I had to ask the question if there is a simplified way to put context to these numbers and these decisions.
I don't think not to the level that you're looking for.
So, Mr. Chair, I think the council may want to consider basically filling in this column, the allocation for the FY20 budget, whether they'd like to stick with the mayor's recommendation or make some other proposal, or if you'd rather delay that until another time.
Yeah, I don't have a problem delaying it till next week when they're both here. And I think it's appropriate that we all engaged in funding our future. We all started. We made those silos. We were part of it. And I think that we need to finish where the funding is going to be allocated. So,
Mr. Chair, is there any information that we can bring forward between now and next Tuesday to help with that process?
yeah, that's a great question. Council members, is there anything that you are lacking that you'd like to see for next week?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I think this sort of goes to Andrew's point, and I know it's probably, as you stated, it's not necessarily possible to have this concise. I would be interested in this scoring and how that works and what criteria are being looked at as much as possible, that you can kind of put that on paper. I think that would be helpful as we're looking at where we're putting this money and how we're prioritizing this money. So if you could provide those criteria as much as possible to us, that would be really helpful for me.
Easy peasy.
Especially because I'm doing the math here, and some of the requests of certain groups, and then the mayor's and the administration recommendation. I mean, we have numbers, some organizations are getting 100%, and some of the other ones are getting 11% or 0%, or, I mean, to me, that's huge, and I think all of them are important, all of them offer really good services to our different populations, but I'm not understanding why somebody would get 0% versus the same organization gets 100% on both of their requests. So that clarification to me would be very helpful. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, I think would it be helpful to prioritize certain of these that have been identified as questions, such as number 7 and 8, CDC and Salt Lake Community Action, that Councilmember Mendenhall talked about reallocating, some detail on that section. The reason I ask that is because these are in sections, so the money is only isolated to each section. It's not as a whole. So it may help context in that one. It sounds like context in the last 3, 12, 13, and 14. And then, are there any others that you have a question on? Okay. Okay. Well, maybe just the whole thing then.
We'll try to distill it into a
Sounds like
digestible.
number 1 and number 2 we're good on. All the others, no. And many of those are definitely because there is a limited dollar amount in each category. And as this body thinks about any funding from fiscal year 19 that you would like to allocate to those efforts, you'll see those numbers change. And so that does provide more flexibility.
Sorry, I'm going to add one more thing to your plate, if I may. If we, this table is really great and helpful, and kind of, I have the simplified version, and I also have up here the more detailed version. On this simplified version, could we add a little column that says how much is available in each of those categories?
Yes.
That would help also as we're looking at prioritizing the different and reallocating or allocating money there.
And I would be happy if any of the council members want to play around with this spreadsheet is one that I produced to try to put everything on one page. I'd be happy if people want to play with numbers to see what kind of things you might be able to do with the funding that's available.
Yeah, I think the original one looked pretty good. It's just big. 'Cause
Yeah, exactly.
It had the number, it had the prioritization on it
Exactly.
and all that, but it probably gives all the information we needed with a few more options. Yeah.
Well, then let me ask a question since you've got it pulled up. Does it distinguish or identify how many individuals are being served with the funds? Great. Maybe if I could have that on the shorter version too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I may. Last week, you asked, not last week, because last week was a holiday
23
week.
days ago I found out.
Yes.
Yeah, I heard that earlier.
You asked for the number of clients served at their full ask versus at the mayor's recommendation. On the simplified form, you would like it at their full ask?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Just want to make sure we're
Yes, I
on
appreciate
the same
that.
page.
Anyone else? Nice. Thank you for being here and getting us situated. So we've got a tentative break right now. Anyone ready for a break? No. Okay. Nice. We're on to item number 9, which is looking at an ordinance for 1760 and 1790 West Associated Avenue zoning map amendment. We have Nick Tarbett from our council office who's coming to the table, as well as senior planner Sarah. Sarah, I'm sorry, is it Javoronak? Pretty close. Can't do it. I know. Maybe if you wouldn't mind saying it one more time in the microphone, I could. Because not only am I going blind, I'm going deaf too.
I can understand. It's all right. So it's Javoronic. Thank you.
All right, Nick.
Okay, so as you mentioned, this is a rezone request at 1760, 1790 West Associated Avenue, standard plumbing. It's from corridor commercial to light manufacturing. The Planning Commission gave a positive recommendation on this. There was not a lot of public input received. It was kind of a straightforward request, so I'll let Sarah go through outlining what the details of it.
Sure. As you said, it is a fairly straightforward request. The rezone is anticipated to allow for expansion of the existing manufacturing use on the site. It's located to the west of Redwood Road on Associated Avenue. Just to put in a little broader context there, the major street to the north is 2100, and then you can see SR 201. The applicant is Standard Plumbing, and they've occupied the site since 1965, and the property was owned for industrial uses until 1995. The 1995 rezoning affected a number of properties in the area, and so the rezone would return the property to M1 and would allow for expansion of the use, and the property would be conforming. The proposal is consistent with Plan Salt Lake and also the West Side Master Plan. And as mentioned, the Planning Commission forwarded a recommendation of a positive recommendation. Are there any questions?
Councilmember Johnston.
Sorry. My only question is the properties to the east on Redwood Road, 1816, 1826, and 42,
Yes.
those are all commercial at this point?
Yes, those are commercial.
Commercial corridor, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
So is the intent to keep those commercial corridors a buffer from Redwood Road to the M1 zone?
Right, that's the intent. The West Side Master Plan recommends having a buffer of about 100 feet off of Redwood Road, and so this property line is about 235 feet from Redwood.
The farthest distance are the nearest ones, 18, 16, and 26.
So along Associated, this is about 235 feet in that stretch right there, if you can see the mouse.
Okay. So in the future, the intent they couldn't come back, or someone else can come back and take those 3 parcels on Redwood and try and go M1 on them?
That wouldn't be consistent with the master plan to have that go to
Okay.
M1.
All right. That was my only concern on this one. So thank you.
I have a follow-up question, and that is, what is the M1 going to provide them that the CC currently does not give them?
The manufacturing use on the site is a permitted use under the M1.
So they're going to look to start developing the property for manufacturing, or?
They've had an existing manufacturing use on the site, but they want to expand it, and the CC zoning doesn't allow for the expansion of that use.
Because they owned it prior, it was already grandfathered in that use, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Nick?
Just to note, you do have, we received a letter today from Richard Reese. He's not able to be here because this was bumped from a previous council meeting due to some timing issues. He apologizes for not being able to be here, but he provided the letter, and the public hearing is tonight.
And there is tentative possible action next week.
Yep.
Great. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We are on to item 10, which is budget amendment number 2 for fiscal year 2019-20 follow-up. We have Ben Ludke, I think, has been here from our office. Mary Beth Thompson, who's the Chief Financial Officer for the city. I believe she's here, yes, in the back. And John Vike, who is the City Budget Director, in case, there he is. This is a real easy one. No one laughed. No one laughed. I thought that it would be fun. Come on now. No, and just for everyone who's following along, we actually pulled items 12, 13, and 14 from our agenda.
Mr. Chair, your humor is too dry. I can't follow it sometimes.
I know, it's true. Thanks, though. Hey, Ben.
This is the third briefing for budget amendment number 2 of fiscal year 20. The council is scheduled to take potential action tonight. As a reminder, you already voted on the transition-related expenses at the November 19th meeting. First, I wanted to give a quick update on fund balance. the council approved spending an additional $27,000 on item A12. This is a new FTE to focus on CIP and impact fees. Instead of, as the administration recommended, hiring the position for 3 months, the council supported 6 months. That additional $27,000 will be coming from fund balance. The current fund balance above the 13% target is $154,581. And this assumes that the council would approve the 5 items in the budget amendment that the administration recommends coming from fund balance. This does not include items A10 and I1, the additional funding for police officer overtime patrols in city parks or in hotspots. So that $154,000 item, when you consider the police overtime, that would be subtracted from the $154,000. The first update is for item A3, the Community and Neighborhoods Department Director and new part-time employees. Attachment 7 to the staff report has the list of all current vacancies in the CAN department. It shows that if the 10 current vacancies were immediately filled, and if no other vacancies occurred through the duration of the fiscal year, there would be just over $120,000 in vacancy savings. However, this does not account for the potential to handle retirements later in this fiscal year. There are a couple of employees who have been with the city for over 30 years who could retire later this fiscal year. We don't know, and that would likely require most, if not all, of those vacancy savings. I can put the vacancy savings up on the big screen, or if there are any questions before I move on to the next item.
Why don't you throw them up there, Ben?
And so what this shows is each of the job titles, the monthly amount of vacancy savings for each title, the number of months it's been vacant, and then notes on when the position was filled or if it is currently still vacant. And scrolling down to the bottom, you'll see it's $120,228 in projected vacancy savings. And this is current as of November 22nd.
Any questions? All right, Ben.
The next item is A10, the police overtime. And the administration sent attachment 8. This provides 5 different plans, Plan A through Plan E, each with an increasing level of service for police officer overtime in city parks until the park squad is finished with training and available. They are anticipated to be available in September of next year. The council is only able to appropriate funding for personnel in the current fiscal year. So bridging the gap until that September date when the park squad is available, you can act on funding for overtime this fiscal year through June, but the July and August dates would need to be addressed in the annual budget. And the council could ask the incoming administration to consider this in the mayor's recommended annual budget. And if the council's interested, staff can also track it and raise it in May and June when the police department budget is discussed. The administration's recommendation for the park patrol overtime included $49,440 for overtime. So as you're going through, and I'll pull it up, as you're going through the different scenarios, when you look in the far right column, for example, Plan A, December to June, $73,920, the $49,440, you would subtract that from the amount in the far right column, and then the difference, in this case, just under $25,000, is the amount that would need to come from fund balance. And we can calculate that if the council decides which plan you prefer, so you can see exactly how much is coming from fund balance. Before the police department goes through their 5 different scenarios, there's some context on current utilization of police officer overtime. The department responded to council questions that the current utilization of voluntary overtime shifts, and there are unscheduled overtime shifts as well, such as for shift extensions or blood draws of suspects. But the voluntary scheduled overtime shifts, approximately half of the current police force participates in. And the median, so if you lined up from the least to the most usage of overtime, the midpoint or the median is 118 hours. This is about 6% of the total standard 2,080-hour work schedule that a police officer would have. Not all of the current voluntary shifts that are posted are filled. Some do go unfilled. That's likely to continue whatever level of funding the council approves for police overtime and parks. It's difficult to estimate what the saturation point is. At what point are you posting overtime shifts that are voluntary that would mostly go unfilled? That's a very difficult thing to estimate, but it's likely any additional overtime would not be 100% filled based on the current utilization.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question on that? Do they have a breakdown of which shifts typically go unfilled most often versus others, or anything like that?
We didn't request that.
Okay.
I wonder if the police department knows off the top of their head, though.
Well, when they come up, we can ask that again. I just didn't know if that was already in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other piece of context we wanted to share is overtime funding. The staff report includes the table shown on the big screen, and this is fiscal years 2018, 2019, and the current fiscal year. And what it shows is that the annual budget had $931,500 budgeted for overtime in fiscal year 2018 and 2019, but the actuals were significantly more. $1.7 million in fiscal year 18 and just over $2 million in fiscal year 2019. And then you can see the differences in this far right column. The current fiscal year, there was a slight increase in the annual budget to $965,000. We are currently at $659,000 in actuals, so there's only 32% left of the remaining budget. And if this trend were to continue based on just the first quarter, which is an assumption, it would be a significant increase over the last fiscal year. We would need additional years of data to see if this is a longer-term trend, probably 5 years or more. But we wanted to point out that there seems to be a difference between the budgeting versus the actuals of overtime in the police department for the last 2.5 years.
Ben, but they're on budget these past 2 years?
So they can use vacancy savings and other personnel
That's what I'm
costs to
asking.
cover. So they are within their budget. They are not going over, but the actuals are significantly more
Sure.
than what was budgeted.
Okay.
Is there a reason behind that? Is it just to make the budget look better? No? It's just using vacancy savings to help?
Yeah, I think the chief should answer that, but
Okay.
my inkling
Oh,
would
we'll
be.
wait for him to, Chief, maybe you can write that down, these questions that are popping up.
Yeah.
We also wanted to point out attachment 10, which has summary information on winter restrooms and parks. It includes lists of parks that have portable restrooms in the winter. And let me pull that one up as well. It also includes costs for the different levels of restroom services and cost estimates to keep permanent restrooms open during the winter. I believe there's only one restroom in Liberty Park, which is currently built and designed that would allow it to be open in the winter if it was funded. Otherwise, there would need to be heaters brought in to other restrooms because the facilities are just not designed to be open in the winter without some form of heat. So the restrooms that have parks are right here. And these are portable restrooms available through the winter. The cost for a single portable is estimated at $75, and this includes cleaning once a week. The ADA portables are slightly more expensive at $130, also cleaned once a week. And it's the Liberty Park Tennis Court Center, which has a restroom that was built with heating and insulation, but it would need additional funding to be open through the winter. The portable electric heaters that would be needed for the other restrooms would heat the facility to about 45 degrees just to prevent the freezing and for comfort. And then the total cost for providing the park restrooms would include an attendant. Otherwise, the issues of individuals camping or using the portable restrooms for shelter would likely happen again. So the attendant is included in the total cost here. And the total estimated cost is $4,000 for the initial setup for each portable restroom. And then the estimated cost ongoing for each restroom each month is $4,454. So with that, I think it would be best to have the police department go through the 5 scenarios that were provided for bridging the gap until the park squad is finished training in September. The Public Services Department also provided a 5th plan, Plan F if you will, that they'll also touch base on.
Come on up, Chief Brown. Nobody's coming with you.
I got nobody. John.
Kelly's coming.
Well, good evening. It's good to see you again. I apologize again. Last time I think I was here, I may have looked like a dog hearing a funny noise, as I maybe not have interpreted your questions as you had expected me to. So I thank you for having me back, giving me that mulligan or a do-over or another swing at the ball. So thank you. And in the spirit of being an overachiever, we're trying to give you everything you wanted and more. We have 5 different scenarios up there that we can go through, and please ask questions as we go so that we can vet this out and understand where we're going. But the question I think you were asking is, what do we do now, right now, to fill that gap until we have those park rangers come on board September of 2020? And so we went back and we looked at, after the meeting we had with our Parks Department, as to what they would like done and what we had done previously. And one of the biggest things they wanted us to do was to close those restrooms. So Plan A, if you look at that looks at closing the restrooms from December through June of 2020. But remember, we're not closing restrooms that aren't open through December, January, February, and March. So really it's for 3 months, April, May, and June. The cost of closing those restrooms with 2 officers, 4 hours a day, 7 days a week is $73,920. Okay, that's just to close the restrooms. Plan B, which we think is a better option, is that we look at funding 4 officers, 4 hours a day, 7 days a week, at a price tag of $114,240. There are a lot of restrooms. That's a pretty quick pace to get through and lock them up. And if you have a problem or an issue, that is going to tie up your officers for some time. If you had 4 officers doing it throughout the summer, they could get through the parks quicker. And remember, we have 81 parks in the city. They could spend time in there looking at curfew and different issues as they arise through the summer months. Plan C is if we were to look at the gap, and the gap is 1 sergeant and 5 officers. That would, or let's just call it 6 officers, because we would fund that on over time. 6 officers working 10 hours a day, 4 days a week would be $432,000. Now, when you look at that, and this is what we need to talk a little bit, or maybe think about what this park squad's going to be able to cover. They only work 4 days a week, 10 hours a shift. So you're really going to have 3 days when you have no park coverage. So Plan C looks at covering exactly what your park squad is going to cover in September. So 1 park squad in September, you're going to have 3 days that are uncovered. You're going to have no bathroom coverage. And so, and I perceive that the park squad is We want them in the park when people are there to interact with the people, to have that community interaction. So if we relegate them to closing restrooms from 10 to 2, that is the time when people aren't in the park. That's not where we do our best work. So that Plan C is just using overtime to fill the gap of the park squad until June 30th. Plan D is just for comparison. If you had 2 squads working 7 days a week, or 4 days a week with 1 coverage, so you have 6 officers working 10 hours a week, 7 days a week with 1 overlap, it would be $864,000. That's on overtime. Plan E would be a park squad of 6 officers working your 10 hours with the additional money to provide park closure or restroom closures under Plan B. So it's really just Plan B plus Plan E added together. Any questions on that? Okay. The next 2 or 3 slides just break those out a little bit more as to the officers, the time of the shift, and kind of what I discussed there earlier in a little more detail. If you go to page 7, I think at some point in this discussion, if we're going to use overtime, which will fill the gap, but it doesn't provide the ownership that a squad would take when they work these different parks and these assignments, and the supervision that we feel would be necessary. At some point, you got to think, what would it take to actually hire another park squad? And so that park squad, if you look at it down there, this is a park squad, 1 sergeant, 5 officers for a total of $755,127. That's what it's going to take to hire to fund another park squad for an entire year. So you're starting to bump up into. We probably ought to look at that if that's the level of service we should be providing. Now, there's the costs of outfitting them, and that number down there, $420,000. That is for their equipment, vehicle, and IMS, their computers and different things. That's an upfront cost of $420,000. But every year after that, it's about $90,000. So you're really looking at about $865,000 a year for an additional park squad. We funded 1. If we're going to really fill that gap and cover those days and have that overlap day and have the ownership of a squad working these different parks, that is probably where we should start looking. Now, if you go to page 8, there's that second half that we don't have funded, or that is not in this fiscal year. That would cover July and August. So the same exact officers working the same hours. So Plan A, to cover the gap between July and August of next fiscal year, would be the $30,240. So to cover that entire gap to September, you're looking at about $104,000. Plan B would be the $60,000 to cover those 2 months of having 4 officers close those restrooms from 10 to 2 in the morning. So if you add that with the prior months, it's $174,000. Plan C is using overtime to fund 6 officers working 10 hours a day, 4 days a week, is $129,000. Add that to the previous slide, and you're looking at $561,000. Plan D is looking at 2 full-time squads, so you have 7 days a week coverage, is $1,123,200. That is adding both the front gap and the second half. And then Plan E is if you're going to use overtime to fill that gap for the entire 8 months and close those restrooms, it's $1.3 million. That's where you're really starting, are we using our overtime the best we could? If that is the service level, and I really, if you really think about it, council, if you have 5 officers and a sergeant, and Ben mentioned the number of 20,000 or 2,080 hours is what they actually work in a year, but if you take out the time for vacation and training and sick and leave, it's about 1,500 hours. So 5 officers is really 3 or 4. And if you're expecting them to cover 81 parks and then try to close those restrooms, the serious conversation is, if that's what we want, we should look at another squad. And I think it would cost less to fund the squad and move forward that way. Any questions yet? The next couple slides, if you look at, we went and asked Public Services, and they gave us their recommendation, and that is page 10, Ben. They were looking at it by areas, area 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they were asking for 2 officers, 8.8 hours a day. And so area 1, to fill that gap between now and June, would be $214,000 in area 1, area 2, area 3, area 4. Area 4, they were asking for 4 officers at 8.5 hours a day, which is really 17 hours, so that was 428. You add that to the gap, and you're looking at almost $1.4 million to fund that with overtime. This is where I think we may be bumping into the saturation point. I don't know if our officers we have enough. That's a lot of overtime. I don't know if we can fill all that. That becomes a question. The overtime that the officers really do like is the department-sponsored overtime, this type of overtime. So other overtimes would probably go on unscheduled. So we might, and we would do our very best to do that. But again, I think it's prudent to start looking at, if that's the expectation, let's fund another squad. With that, I'm willing to take any questions you may have.
Questions for the chief? Councilmember Johnston.
The first is probably a statement, Mr. Chair. I think in the coming year in our priority discussions, which I hope we have with the new council, I do want to push for a discussion about parks oversight overall. And I think this would flow into that discussion as far as funding for maintenance of parks, expansion needs, and also part of this, that'd be oversight. So I want to preface what I'm going to say by that. So I think that should be a part of that discussion as well, Chief, not just part of your budget, but combined. Second question is, in the scenarios, they sort of either or, closing bathrooms only, and it sounds like you're right that closing bathrooms through the wintertime is not the same as starting in April or May, whenever they open again?
Right.
Okay.
Well, April, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question I have is, based on any data we have, is daytime hours in the wintertime, I'm thinking, so December through, say, March, when daylight is only daytime hours really till, say, 6 o'clock average. Is that the biggest need? After hours is the biggest need, assuming the bathrooms are closed already. I'm just thinking of the parks in my district, and when is the need greatest there for supervision? I'm not sure it's when there's a lot of people there. Does that make sense? I know for community policing it makes sense, but for criminal activity it may not be during the peak hours of people using the park, because there's a lot of eyes on things. I'm thinking of, say, Poplar Grove Park in my neighborhood, where when it's vacant, big issues happen there.
Yeah.
So trying to figure out, from your perspective, do you see any need to modify those hours to hit the actual need for security in parks?
Yeah, I just used, very good, that's a good point. I think we should be very, very strategic in how we stagger their days off. I would see somebody working, these squads working, one squad working Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, the other squad working Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, so the common day might be a Saturday or a Sunday. I think maybe we stagger their shifts also, so that we incorporate the times when there's high usage of the park. Because it's important that people that go to the park, I know the parks are very much loved, and it's important that we keep criminal activity down during those times. But people need to feel safe, and I want that too, and I want that interaction. But also strategically, we can look at when the vandalisms are occurring and things like that. And part of this plan would be to leverage all the assets of the police department, the CIU officers, our host officers, our Community Connections Center, our CIT officers, everything that we can do to provide outreach and help in the parks, because they have become kind of a place where those that are experiencing homelessness may go. And we through our co-responding model, we reach out and try to help those folks. So I think we should be very, very strategic in how we lay this out.
So in the scenarios, you're not wed to the actual time. Say,
No.
Here we're at 9 to 5:30.
Yeah,
but
I was just using
number
this.
of hours would be the.
Yeah, that's a placeholder for hours.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
please.
placeholder for hours.
Yeah, no.
If we needed a modified version between December and June, that in the wintertime months, it's fewer hours in the parks necessarily, but come warmer weather, it's more hours. Would the cost change, or would you just offset fewer hours for 3 months with more hours for 2 to 3 months?
Well, if we fund officers, we're looking. I have to put. They're on 410s, and so I have to adjust their schedules so that they're the most effective.
But for overtime, for instance,
But the overtime, we can put that anywhere, wherever we need to. But that was the one priority of the parks, is if you'll help us close those restrooms and make sure people aren't in the parks after hours. And once we continue, after we change the culture that you can't be in the parks, I think that'll pay dividends for us as to the vandalisms and things that are occurring at night.
Okay, because that was my concern with these, the 5 plans on the board right now, that if they're static from December through June, but the needs are very different December, January, February, from March, April, May.
Yeah.
Okay.
Councilmember Johnston, I think that what might actually help us with all of this scenarios is bringing up public services to discuss what they actually need with the parks. So I'm wondering, I know that Lisa Schaefer, the public services director, is here. I don't know if she wants to come up or wants to send her deputy director up, because I think for me personally, if we're looking at funding park rangers, let's find exactly from the Parks Department what they need and what they're looking for.
While she's walking up, the city has 81 parks. Half of them are smaller mini parks or pocket parks. There are 47 miles of paved and unpaved urban trails and just under 1,700 acres of natural lands. So those are kind of the 3 recreation areas that are contemplated when you're thinking about where or how to prioritize where the officers would be going.
Hi, thanks. It's Kristen Riker. So the chief is exactly right, as far as, coming up with a strategic plan to get the police officers in our parks during different times of the day. I thought it might be helpful to clarify the restrooms and closing the restrooms, and that 10 a.m. to 2 a.m. hour is an odd time to ask our police officers to be in our parks. But the reason why we're asking for that is because it really is the time when most of the activity happens in our park that isn't a good thing. And our parks staff that the chief met with were mostly our supervisors and our employees who work directly in the parks. And those folks are the ones that get there at 6 a.m. and open the door to potentially a very violent situation in the park, and have been threatened with all sorts of different things, from glass to all sorts of tools or sticks, and chased in our park. And that is their biggest fear, is getting there in the morning and seeing and just being surprised by those folks in the restrooms. But having police officers there during different times of the day and in the evening, I think eventually would be the goal, because people will know that they'll be showing up, and then they'll discontinue doing some of those things, emptying our large garbage cans and putting them over our sprinkler heads so that they don't get wet at night. And there's all sorts of things that happen at night when there's nobody in the park besides the folks that are sleeping. So that was our intention there.
And just, here's a number for you. Just, if you wanted to fund the 4 officers to close the parks, or to close the restrooms and do the park curfews, it's $243,000 a year. So whatever plan we decide, I would recommend I would ask that you fund that, because I think that's a very important component to what the parks need and their people need. And then we can decide how we want to fill that gap with the different plans that we've looked at. But I think overtime is a good start, but at some point, overtime is going to surpass what it would really cost to have another squad.
That budget amount is for 12 months, you said?
Yeah, but that, we only do it for the 8 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that would be the annual funding balance.
Any more questions for the chief while he's up here?
The one question, sir, that I wanted to answer for you is in our overtime budget. In a previous administration, we were asked to give up some budget cuts. We gave up, I think, $500,000 in overtime. That was our budget cut. And so that is why we've always gone over, is because it was taken away and never reimbursed. And so we've always covered that with attrition savings every year. But that's why it's such a disparate number. It was given away in a budget cut.
But I think my concern is that, at least from first glance, annually, we're going up $300,000 to $400,000 a year in overtime. Is that, you see what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
whether it's a decrease of $500,000 that you had savings, we're still going up $300,000 to $400,000 annual for overtime.
Yeah.
Which kind of scares me, like you're talking about with that saturation. What point do we not fill those overtime positions, right?
Yeah, very good.
All right, council members, any questions for Chief or Kristen Riker? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The next update is for item A12. Attachment 6 has the job description for the Capital Improvement Program and Impact Fee Administrator. And this is the position I mentioned earlier that the council supported funding for 6 months. Next is item D2, a request for $1.5 million budget increase for the Home Investment Partnership, First-Time Homebuyer and Housing Renovation Program. Attachment 9 provides a 2-page overview of this program as well as some of the history involved. As of November 19th, the remaining budget for the current fiscal year is $312,552. This is enough for 2 home mortgages or 4 to 5 rehabilitation projects. The longstanding practice for this program was to use repaid loans and request in the annual budget those receipts from the repaid loans to cover the next fiscal year's expenditures for the program. So it's a self-perpetuating program. That didn't happen for some reason in the fiscal year 20 annual budget, which is why this request is coming to the council in the budget amendment. Because the program is set up to be self-perpetuating in this way, it is not part of the annual competitive grant review process that comes before the council in March and April each year. And it appears this was done intentionally. It does create pros and cons. There are 2 policy questions for the council. One is if you want to approve some or all of the $1.5 million budget request, or if you'd like to schedule a briefing to continue learning more about this program. The other is whether some form of an annual review would be helpful for the council, either to bring it more in line with the processes for other city budgets, such as periodic reporting so that the council receives a check-in each year. Right now, besides the annual budget request, the program kind of operates outside of most of the The program has been around for, I think, 40 plus years, and it's been using the federal home dollars for at least the last 20 years. So it has been around for a long time. If there are any questions, I believe hand staff is here to discuss.
Looks like Councilmember Johnston has a question.
Can you repeat the so if it typically gets loan repayment into its system to self-perpetuate, explain to me where that money's gone then in this last fiscal year.
So it's sitting in a holding account, essentially. The council has not provided budget authorization for the repaid loans to be used again for this program.
So the money's there, we just haven't taken action.
That is correct. There's currently a little over $2 million in repaid loans. And what would happen in previous years is there'd be a $1 or $1.5 million request in the annual budget to use the repaid loans in the next fiscal year to continue the program. That did not happen in fiscal year 20.
Do you know why?
I do not.
We have a Deputy Director, Jennifer Mcgrath.
Hi, thank you. My understanding is that in the loss of the hand director sort of during the budget process, that item just got missed. It never got to the CAN admin department to be considered. It's something that is part of our annual budget process every year. It's a normal ongoing thing, and somehow this year it just didn't make it from hand to CAN. And all I can assume is that because we lost some staff during that time, it just got missed.
During the transition.
Yes.
Great. That was easy.
Thank you.
All right, Ben. Is that it? Does anyone have any other questions on that? What Ben has been going over? Good.
The other update is on item D3, the General Obligation Bonds 2019A. These are the first issuance of the streets reconstruction bonds, the 87 million voters approved last November. And there's a table in the staff report showing the breakdown up to $20 million and the estimated costs for each of the major streets. There is a category for local streets. It does not specifically list each of the local street segments. That information would come back to the council once the projects are completed. So we have the cost estimates and the locations for the major streets. The local streets, because there are many more of them and they're much smaller dollar amounts, once those are built, those costs would come back to the council just for the report about what happened with the money, especially since the expectation last year to the public was that there'd be a report on how the funding was used. Other than that, there's council added item I1, which is the additional funding for patrols in city parks or hotspots. If the council wants to discuss hotspots versus parks now, or you could continue the discussion at your next meeting on December 10th.
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. Right now, staff can prepare a motion sheet to adopt the items that the council doesn't want to adopt for tonight, which would be the police overtime, so item A10 and I1. Were there any other items you wanted to hold off on adopting tonight?
Cindy Gus Jensen.
I might be repeating, but that council-sponsored property item needs to be pulled. You've got that already.
Yeah, it's been withdrawn.
Great.
Okay, other than the police overtime, we'll update the motion sheet for the other items to be voted on tonight.
Great. And, you know, I appreciate everyone's work on this. I know that this has been a long time coming since October 15th, our first briefing, and here we are. Might take action tonight, so that's great. Appreciate all your hard work on this. We are on to our item number 11. I'll tell you what's going on. We are going to go through item number 11, and then we're going to look to move into a closed session. And then after the closed session, we will reconvene at 6:20 for board appointments. All right? So let's talk about required fee waiver for youth participating in youth city programs. We have Sylvia Richards from our council office who's here, as well as I believe Kim Thomas from Public Services Youth and Family Division Director. No? Yes. And Noel Walkingshaw. What is your current title, Noel?
I'm the Deputy Director of Public Services, Administrative Services Director.
Great.
My boss, that's what we call him.
Yeah, Noel was just the go-to guy to get stuff done, so, you know.
And I'm here mostly to smile because Kim knows all of the answers.
Great. All right, Sylvia.
Right, so the city applied for and received the after-school match partnership grant from the Utah Department of Workforce Services. And this grant provides $250,000 for the next 3 years for school break and after-school U-City programming. With this grant, the city is required to waive programming-related fees for youth who qualify for the free school lunch and offer a sliding fee scale to those who qualify for reduced lunch in order to use the grant funding. And the fee waiver prompted the public benefit analysis, and the public hearing is tonight in your during your formal meeting. And Kim, did you have anything you wanted to add?
What we would be doing is just adding one more category to our existing sliding fee scale. So we're looking at a potential revenue loss of $20,000 to $30,000. Those families only pay $11 a month anyway, as it is. We will be gaining $230,000, however, if we accept the grant.
With the grant money?
Yeah, that's $230,000 a year for the next 3 years.
That's great. It's a win-win, right? I don't think anyone has questions about that, so.
I love that win-win.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So we are going to look for a motion to go into closed session for certain reasons. And I'm looking to our city attorney just to make sure we get this all done correctly.
Mr. Chair, I move that we go into a closed session for the purposes of discussing strategies to discuss, strategy regarding the purchase, sale, exchange, or lease of real property, including any form of water right or water shares, and then also for the purposes of discussing deployment of security personnel.
Second. Oh, sorry.
Yes, Cindy, hang on one second.
Apologies. We had a glitch with the item D, the strategy discussion to discuss real property. And so actually we were just asking you to convene about item F, the discussion regarding deployment of security personnel.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I didn't see.
Oh, that's okay. I did think it was odd. Okay, an odd combo.
There you go, though.
Real estate acquisition and deployment of security personnel. So I will withdraw the.
Just security personnel.
I will. You know what? Let's just start over.
Sounds good.
Withdrawn motion, new motion, that we go into closed session to discuss issues regarding the deployment of security personnel, devices, or systems.
Second.
Okay, motion by Councilmember Wharton, second by Councilmember Valdemoros. We'll roll call this. Councilmember Johnston? Yes. Councilmember Wharton?
Yes.
Councilmember Rogers is yes. Councilmember Valdemoros? Yes. And she is a yes. And Councilmember Fowler is just left, but. Oh, she's a yes as well. So we are fully unanimous in moving into a closed session. So if you're not supposed to be here for that, we ask you kindly to leave. Oh, and dinner is in on the table. It's
slcgov.com under elections, and we always have a page listing midterm vacancy information, but if there's a specific vacancy, the deadlines and the time frame and the process and the public meeting where that vacancy would be filled would all be defined there.
And now it's time for our History Minute.
Decorating storefront windows for the holidays is nothing new.
and in Salt Lake, the tradition goes back as far as we've had storefronts. Through the early 1900s, shops all over downtown got in on the holiday spirit and drew people to the area by elaborately decorating their windows. In the 1970s, ZCMI kicked off a new tradition that combined the window displays of the past with candy decorations. These candy windows became a mainstay of shopping downtown. This continued all the way up until 2012, when ZCMI, then Meyer and Frank, closed to make way for the City Creek development. When Macy's took the space over, they decided to continue the tradition of the candy windows, selecting 6 artists every year to create elaborate candy displays, drawing in visitors from all over the state.
Thanks for watching another episode of Capital City News. Join us next time to stay up to date on all the latest. For SLC TV, I'm Poonam Kumar. Thanks for watching SLC TV, Salt Lake City's Government Access Channel. On this week's episode of Capital City News, we hear from Supreet Gill, Salt Lake City's new Sustainability Program Manager, about food equity and inclusion in the city. And our History Minute is about part-time Salt Laker Adam Yauk of the Beastie Boys. Let's get started with our legislative update and look back.
At its November 12th meeting, the City Council held a fact-finding session relating to homelessness, received a presentation from the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute about affordable housing issues in the city, and, acting as the redevelopment agency, they heard proposals for the Utah Theater and adjacent retail property, and they also approved the RDA's budget amendment, which provided funding for a new track station at 650 South Main Street, as well as other projects. To learn more, visit slc.gov/council. Cold car interiors are uncomfortable and frosted windshields are a safety hazard, but leaving your car running unattended to warm up and defrost is an open invitation to auto theft. Last year, 135 vehicles were stolen because owners left their vehicles running and idling. Keep your car and property safe while clearing the air by staying idle-free. For more safety tips, visit slcpd.com.
The Utah Census Area Office is currently hiring over 4,000 temporary positions in Salt Lake County. Pay begins at $17 per hour with a flexible schedule. Census takers provide the perfect opportunity for students, retirees, and part-time or seasonal workers to earn some extra income while helping count our community. Apply today at 2020census.gov/jobs. Food is a basic need shared by all. Food not only feeds us, but it nourishes us and connects us. Supreet Gill, Salt Lake City Sustainability Program Manager, talks to us about the importance of food and equity programs in our city.
I mean, essentially, food is the foundation that connects us all. It is, and a community's food system is such a complex system. It's a complex web of relationships and networks, and from producers to consumers, but there's so much more in between. There's distribution systems, there is food access in terms of accessibility and availability of healthy food and affordability of healthy food. There's food safety challenges, there's so much on the consumption, and then of course the environmental impacts around that. So food can be a very complex topic and a very complex system. Utah produces 2% of its vegetables and 3% of its produce. So we are not very food secure at all, and our production systems are not fully functioning. There's a handful of farmers that produce most of that produce. There's land scarcity, there's water scarcity, there's human labor scarcity. So there's all these challenges, and then that's just on the production end. On the distribution end, there's even more, and then on the consumption end, there's even a more elaborate challenge in terms of food access. So we at the city really hope to alleviate some of these challenges and these gaps in need and services by creating programs that have a more targeted approach. So we have 7 community gardens on city land in partnership with Wasatch Community Gardens. One is going to come online hopefully next year. We have our microfood, the Microloan Fund for Farmers, and the Microloan Fund for Farmers is a way for the city to support our small to medium-sized, or sometimes even legacy farmers in their operations in terms of helping purchase equipment, season extension stuff, seeds, and that increases the amount of fruits and vegetables that come into the city. So we've seen a really great uptick in the amount of produce that's available at the winter market through that program. So one of the goals of the city's food programs is to have food equity and to have that be a key component in our community's food system. And equality and equity are different in sort of the foundational ways. And the way that I could best describe it is, imagine an apple tree. And so if you want to have everyone be able to pick an apple from an apple tree, the tall person has an advantage and they can just go pick an apple right away. However, a child may need a child-safe sort of ladder to reach the apple.
For everything. So serving on the committee, I think, can serve a couple different things that are important to me. One, making sure that, you know, the important issues from somebody who's on the road every day, all through winter as well, can be heard. That it's you know, an opportunity for me to also converse with other people in the community to learn what they want and what they want to hear, and to promote what I think is an awesome form of transportation that can keep us in shape, keep cars off the road, and hopefully clean up the air a tad.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Martin, why don't you tell us the same thing, but a different version?
Yes, more or less. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm from Europe, from the Czech Republic originally, came here 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, work at the University of Utah. I also primarily move myself around by bike. These days I have a 1-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I'm moving the 1-year-old to the daycare at the U from Sugar House every day. So I can kind of attest from first hand how it is to kind of move around with the vulnerable people behind you. And that's the main reason I want to go on a board, to try to shape the direction where the city goes with respect to kind of be more open or more accommodating to sort of not just, you know, a single person on a bike, but say the whole family on a bike. We are on near 17th East and 21st South. Yeah, so I take 15th East to the U. It's pretty nice. It's the only grip I have these days is that the snow doesn't get clean very well from the bike lane when the cars are parked right next to it. So we have to take the main lane, you know, which makes me a little bit nervous with the kid behind, but it will melt in a few days. So, well, anyway, that's actually one of the things I would like the BAC to kind of take on, is to be a little bit more serious about snow cleaning of the bike lanes in the winter.
BACK. I mean, BIKE, right? Yes. It should have been bike. Yeah. Any other questions for these two fine gentlemen?
Thank you so much. Awesome. Thank you so much for volunteering your time.
Thank you.
You'll be on the consent agenda tonight. You're more than willing to go across the hall and listen to your name your name won't be called. It'll just be say, we'll approve the consent agenda, or you'll feel free to go home. It looks like everyone's in favor of you being on these boards, and we're appreciative of you willing to serve. So
Great.
thank you.
Thank you all for your time.
Yep.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Yeah, we'll do.
I don't know, they're all scheduled for 6:20, so we don't have anyone else. It's 6:30. Bobby's going to go check one more time. So we have 3 that are currently not here. Jacqueline Thiel, Jonathan Ramirez, and Gabriella Knudsen.
Okay, so Gabriella, See, Gabriella will not be here today. She needs to come on the 10th, and we did not connect with Martin.
Okay.
But that was Martin. Okay.
Martin and Daniel were both
Okay,
here.
so we need to pull,
Jonathan, Jacqueline, and Gabriella.
yeah, okay.
Okay, well, that is it for our work session today. We will adjourn for 30 minutes, and we'll reconvene across the hall for the formal meeting.